Cool. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of our webinar series on climate finance. My name is Amin. I'm a director here at S4S, and I'm really excited to be hosting this webinar with a really fantastic speaker that will be talking about carbon credits and all things climate finance. So before we kind of go into that, it would be good for us to kind of talk about Somalis for Sustainability, who we are as an organization. And essentially, we started off as a group of young Somalis who were working within the climate space and wanted to connect and kind of drive impact in this space. In 2023, we had the opportunity to go to COI 18, which is the world's largest youth climate conference. And one of the things that we noticed was that Somalia had a very limited presence at these sort of youth forums, and we sought to kind of change that because obviously, as many of us know, the kind of climate impacts is quite pronounced in Somalia. And so kind of looking at the climate impacts over the last decade or so, the kind of frequency and intensity of extreme weather conditions has kind of increased. Despite being sort of a semi-arid climate, we've seen a number of droughts that have unfortunately led to famines and also flash floodings, which have taken a lot of lives and led to many people being displaced throughout the Horn. This coupled with sort of the inadequate kind of resources, but also the kind of financing required to be able to respond to these issues has compounded the issue even further and has meant that Somalia is one of the most climate vulnerable countries around in the world. So kind of as an organization, we sort of set out to kind of do our bit in terms of getting the conversation on that and engaging the young people that are in the country. And as diaspora, kind of bridging the gap between those two communities. And we sort of launched officially in 2024. And our kind of focus was on how do we sort of engage the stakeholders in this space, and how do we help the young people that are already working in this space to be able to engage with diaspora. And so since then, we've had two kind of really big things that have happened. We were one of the co-hosts of Somalia's kind of first ever local conference of youth. So roughly around 100 people came together in Mogadishu last year, August, to kind of discuss the biggest issues that young people are facing in the country. And we were able to produce something called a national youth statement, which was presented to policymakers and kind of had all the different themes that were important and relevant to the young people in the country. And hopefully by passing that on with policymakers, they were able to sort of engage and understand exactly, what sort of areas that they should be focusing on. The second point is we sent a delegation to COP29 in Azerbaijan from across the world, from the UK, Ireland, and Australia, and participating as a civil society organization within the wider Somali delegation. And there we were able to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Institute of Climate and Environment, which is a kind of climate institution based in Mogadishu that is an offshoot of the Simad University, to be able to kind of connect and drive research and capacity building on a number of climate topics, including loss and damage and climate adaptation. Outside of that, we've also kind of launched a newsletter, which has kind of been in its 8th edition now, a monthly newsletter talking about all things sustainability, where we cover current projects happening in the Horn, but also regional kind of climate updates, whether that'll be conferences or kind of major investments being, planned for the continent. And in our first webinar last year, August, we did our webinar on renewable energy with Bruno from the International Energy Agency, and we kind of zoomed in on the region and kind of what are the sort of wins that we can potentially get in terms of solar energy, and how that can kind of propel the economic development throughout the region. And so that's a bit about us. Going on to our speaker today, Hugh. He's a senior director at market development and partnerships at Gold Standard, and he'll talk a little bit more about Gold Standard as an organization, one of the kind of main registries for climate, carbon credits. And his kind of role is overseeing partnerships with governments, corporates, investors, and project developers. In his previous roles, he spent a number of years, close to a decade, in the British government, holding a range of roles, as you can see here, in the international carbon markets, the Treasury, and the Department of Energy and climate change. So, without further ado, really want to introduce our speaker. So, Hugh, over to you, and we're going to leave this slide at the end so you guys can follow us on social media and kind of fill out a feedback form of how you found the event. So over to you, Hugh. I'll just let you share your screen.
Great, thank you very much. And hello to everyone. It's really nice to have been invited to speak. I look forward to sharing a little bit more with you about carbon credits, about carbon markets, and then I hope to be able to have a good discussion after that as well. So I think I'm probably going to try to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I don't want it to be Q&A. I'd like it to be quite discussive, because I think there's the right amount of us here to be able to have a discussion around this. So that's my hope with this session. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. So if all's working well, you should be able to see my slides now. Is everything working well? I think so. So the organization I work for is called Gold Standard, and it's one of the standard setters in the carbon market, the international carbon market. And I'll come on in a little bit to talk a bit more about what carbon credits are and to go into some of the fundamentals. But Gold Standard as an organization was set up about 20 years ago. And it was set up by WWF and by other NGOs to try to set best practice in the carbon market. And I share that at the start because we were set up kind of in acknowledgement that there's a bad way to do carbon markets and there's a bad way to do carbon finance. And we were set up to try to do it better. And so I'm going to share some information in the next 20 minutes or so on what carbon credits are, some of the practicalities around them. But I'm also going to get into some of the criticism and some of the challenges which they face, because I think it's important to talk about that and to talk about how things can be done in a way that's right and that delivers positive benefits for the climate, but also delivers sustainable development as well. And I've been a Gold Standard for the past 4 years. So in this job, I'm focused on all of our engagement with those who are developing projects, which essentially means kind of delivering actual impact on the ground. But also we work with many governments across the world. We kind of engaged with about 70 governments over the past year to look at how carbon markets can fit into their climate plans and to make sure that this is well integrated into their work. And you can see here a little bit of the impact which we've had as an organization. So we have around 350 project developers who are using our standard, so using the rules that we set as Gold Standard. We have projects in over 100 countries across the world, including in Somalia, and I'll come on to that later on in this presentation. And these projects have delivered over 300 million tons of CO2 reductions, so reductions in greenhouse gases over the past 20 years. And what's important for us as Gold Standard is that these projects aren't just delivering climate benefits, they're also delivering wider development impacts as well. And so we kind of take a lot of effort to make sure that we're kind of calculating and measuring the benefits of projects for gender equality, for improved health, job creation, nature conservation, and other elements which can come with a good project. So this is important to the work that we do. Just starting by really at the basics of what a carbon credit is. So many of you will know this, and I apologize if this is kind of starting too basic for some of you. But if you're thinking about carbon pricing and placing a price on carbon and the role of markets in kind of carbon, there's really 3 different ways to think about it. One way is a carbon tax, which the UK has, for instance, through its carbon price floor. Other countries have as well, where the government sets a tax on emissions of carbon, and if you're a company, you have to pay that tax for everything which you emit. So a carbon tax is one way. A second way is an emission trading system. So that's where a government will have a set of sectors within its economy. It will set an overall cap on how many emissions can be produced by that sector as a whole. And it creates a volume of allowances which equal that amount of kind of permitted greenhouse gases. And these allowances, each of them represent 1 ton of CO2, and they can be traded between companies. And for every ton of CO2 that you permit, you have to surrender an allowance to the government. And there's a difference between an allowance and the third element of kind of carbon pricing, which is carbon credits. So an allowance in an emissions trading system essentially represents a right to permit. So there is a certain volume of rights to permit within an emissions trading system. What a carbon credit is a representation, an asset, which represents a ton of CO2 which has actually already been reduced or removed from the atmosphere. So carbon credits are issued by organizations like us and Gold Standard when a project has followed our rules and when it has demonstrated and has had audited the fact that it has reduced CO2 through the intervention that it's made, or it has removed CO2 or kind of other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So that reduction could be from projects which install renewable energy and mean that energy comes from renewable sources rather than fossil fuel sources. The removals could come from tree planting, which sequesters carbon, but could also come from some new technologies as well, which are looking at taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But every carbon credit which exists in the world, if things are done well, should represent 1 ton of CO2 equivalent that has been reduced or removed. And how are these generated? So the essentials of what a carbon credit is you have a scenario, the kind of business as usual baseline scenario. So what would have happened if carbon finance, carbon credits weren't in this kind of context at all? And so an example of this is electricity, which is generated from the burning of coal. You then have an intervention, which is a change, an active measure, which is taken by a project developer. And so in this example, that could be the installation of solar panels. So solar panels are introduced. And then kind of because of that, you have the project scenario. So what has happened because of the installation of solar PV? And so in this context here, you have a baseline, which is the volume of greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of burning coal. You have an intervention, which means that the volume of greenhouse gases which are emitted is reduced, and credits are issued for the gap between that. So the gap between the baseline and the project scenario, that's what we issue carbon credits for. And we'll come on in a second to some of the kind of key features of what's important for carbon finance. But 2 things that you can see are really important here already for a good carbon market project. One is making sure that you really know your baseline. So you really know what was going to have happened if you didn't have carbon finance. So having a good baseline is really important because that's what you measure carbon from. The third thing that's really important, the second thing, sorry, that's really important is really accurately measuring what an activity has actually done. So there's proper measurement of what's actually been delivered by an activity. And that measurement is audited by a third-party organization as well to make sure that there's a kind of proper evaluation of what's been done. And then another thing that's really important here is making sure that this intervention in the middle happened because of carbon finance. So one of the things that a concept which we have is kind of is fundamental in the carbon market is the concept of additionality. And that's the idea that something wouldn't have happened if it wasn't from carbon finance. So in this scenario here, what you want to avoid is that it was kind of more cost effective anyway to install solar PV than to carry on burning coal. If that's the case, there's no need for carbon credits. But if you're in a scenario in a country context where it's very expensive to install solar PV, or there are other barriers to do so, that's exactly where carbon finance can come in. So carbon finance, the money which you can get from selling carbon credits, the role that it can play is making financially viable something that otherwise wouldn't have made financial sense. And so in this context here, the money that can be generated from selling carbon credits should be at the right level to make it possible to install solar PV and for that to make financial sense. So that's kind of the theory of how carbon markets can work well. Obviously, in the real world, there are scenarios where additionality is more questionable, etc. But this is the theory of how carbon finance and carbon markets should work well. Some examples of where carbon credits come from, so different project types, which you can see in the carbon market. On the left here, you can see a couple of prominent examples of more nature-based solutions in the carbon market. So one of the activity types that is the most prominent in the carbon market is avoiding deforestation. So deforestation is happening across the world. Carbon finance is being used as an incentive to protect forests, so to protect forests from deforestation and degradation. Some of you who've been following will have also seen that this is one of the activity types that's come under most criticism for the quality of credits, but it's one of the ones that has been most prominent. The second one is afforestation, so finance to support the planting of trees where this otherwise wouldn't have happened. And so both of these are kind of two sides of the same coin, really, in supporting kind of prominent forestry across the world. Two other activity types which are important in the carbon market. One is renewable energy, and renewable energy historically was a hugely popular activity type in the carbon market. That's changing in many parts of the world because the costs of renewable energy are falling. And so there is less of a kind of rationale and there's less of a justification for carbon credits being issued to renewable energy projects in many parts of the world. That's not the case in all countries. And so as gold standard, for instance, we still allow renewable energy projects in least developed countries, but we wouldn't provide credits to a similar project in the UK because you just don't need the finance in the same way. Another example of a project type for carbon credits is sustainable agriculture. There are much less projects in the sector so far, but there's a huge amount of potential for carbon finance. And so for the financial incentive from carbon credits to support farmers to move to more sustainable practices. And so we have examples of this, like kind of improved management of soil conditions, for instance, improved practices of rice cultivation. And then there are other examples of different ways in which carbon finance can work in the agricultural sector. And then two final ones, which are very prominent under gold standard. One is clean cooking. So providing a financial incentive and a subsidy to move households, schools, and other institutions away from open fires to cleaner cooking solutions. And this comes with carbon benefits, but it also comes with the benefit of avoiding deforestation, improved health, time saving, many other benefits as well, which come from clean cooking. And then finally, biogas. So biogas is a kind of pretty popular form of carbon crediting in the carbon market as well. Who buys carbon credits? So carbon credits and carbon markets don't work if you just have projects in the supply side. You need entities on the other side who are providing a demand signal and who are willing to buy carbon credits and to provide the finance for it. And there are broadly two different buckets of buyers. One is a compliance buyer. So this is a buyer, often a company, which is required to buy carbon credits because of a regulated policy which is in place within their jurisdiction. Some examples of this are here on the right-hand side. So there are several countries across the world where companies are subject to carbon taxes, but they can meet a portion of their carbon tax liability by purchasing and retiring carbon credits. So this is the case, for instance, in Singapore, Colombia, but then also South Africa as well. There are some governments which use carbon credits to help them to achieve their targets under the UNFCCC. So previously their targets under the Kyoto Protocol, and now also their targets under the Paris Agreement. And then finally, there is a scheme for international aviation, which requires any increase in emissions from international aviation to be offset through carbon credits. So there are several areas of demand for carbon credits under regulation, but there are also companies who buy carbon credits voluntarily because they want this to be part of their climate strategy, or because they want to be able to claim publicly that they have compensated for the emissions from their products, from their goods, from their activities. And this is an area, we'll come on later to some of the controversies and criticisms of the carbon market. The types of companies who are buying credits, the ways in which they buy them, the ways in which they make claims about them, this is a real area where carbon markets come under criticism. And it's an area where there's lots of focus right now to make sure that if you do have companies who are buying credits, they're doing so in the right way, and they're talking about it in the right way, and they're not making claims that are misleading. They're not using this as an excuse not to actually reduce their emissions, but they're doing this in a way that's complementary to the action they're taking. And getting this right is really tricky, and we can maybe talk about that a bit later as well. So just to move on now to getting started with a project. So if you're interested in the carbon market, if you've got an activity you want to implement, you think carbon finance could be an important source of finance to make the project work, what are the initial steps that you need to take to get this going? I'll actually get the first two here. The two of these are feasibility and financing. So making sure that the project actually works. So is legal title secured to the carbon rights, for instance? Is the right kind of organizational structure in place for the project to work? And also, where will the financing come from? So if you're a project which is looking to receive carbon finance, one of the things that you have to think about is that you only get carbon credits after you've actually delivered something. So carbon credits come after you've proved that you have delivered an impact. And that means that there is this time lag from a project starting through to some of the finance coming in. And so working out how that kind of gap will be bridged is really important. And that could be through pre-selling of carbon credits. It could be through trying to take out a loan or get other funding from a bank or a financial institution based on the fact that carbon credits will be sold. There may be different ways in which this is managed, but getting the finances kind of clear from the start. Understanding where carbon finance fits into this is really important. Stakeholder engagement is a massively important early step. And so Gold Standard doesn't kind of really start to look at a project and allow it to be listed on a registry until the project has undergone a kind of full and properly done stakeholder consultation. And this isn't just a kind of box ticking exercise. This is kind of really fundamentally important to making sure that a project's designed in a way that works with the people who may be affected by it. Proper benefit sharing arrangements are kind of put in place. Feedback is taken on board from local communities, and that there's really buy-in from the start to make this something which is sustainable. So stakeholder engagement is a crucial early part of the project. And then the kind of step after you've done all of that is registration with a standard. And that's where an organization like ours fits in, Gold Standard. We are one of kind of many organizations now which act as standards, but there's kind of maybe 4 or 5 which are more prominent in the world. And a standard is the organization that sets the rules for how a project needs to be designed, the calculation, the way it calculates its emission reductions, and a standard is also the organization that will issue the carbon credits to a project. And choosing the standard is very important because the standard really is one way for a project to demonstrate its credibility. So working with a standard which has weak rules, which isn't kind of known or respected internationally, will mean that you don't necessarily get the value, the price for your credits that you want. But working with a standard that is well-renowned, is properly run, has the right rules in place, will mean that your project and your credits get recognized. Buyers are interested and may be willing to pay a higher price for them as well. I'm conscious I'm speaking a lot and not stopping. The way that my screen is set up, I can't see anyone. So I'm going to carry on going. I don't have too many more slides, and then I'll stop for questions after that. I hope that's okay. So just to go over some of the core concepts in carbon markets. And I've talked about some of these before, but these are the things that are kind of really fundamental for a project to be designed well, and to kind of protect against some of the scrutiny that and criticism which may otherwise come. So the first of these concepts is additionality. And this is really fundamental. Carbon credits and carbon finance should be there to make possible an activity that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So if, take cook stoves, for example, if there was no need to subsidize clean cook stoves in order for them to be kind of taken up at scale, then it wouldn't make sense for carbon finance to be used for cook stove activities. But the reason why kind of carbon finance is needed there is because it's often more expensive, or there are other barriers to rolling out clean cooking solutions in countries. And so additionality, showing that carbon finance is needed for a project to work, is very important. Robust quantification. So this is kind of strange wording, but essentially making sure that what someone says has been done has actually been done. That's the kind of simpler way to put this. And this is where you get a lot of criticism in the carbon market if things are done well. So making sure that you have a well-structured baseline, so you're properly assessing what would have happened if it wasn't for carbon finance and for the activity, and then making sure that you're properly calculating what an activity is actually done. That is incredibly important, because these two things are the basis on which carbon credits are issued. So having proper quantification, having this reviewed by a third-party auditor, that's really essential to carbon credits really representing 1 ton of CO2. Permanence is very important in some sectors. So if you're planting trees, there is always the risk of fires. There is always the risk of other damage, which will mean that those trees are no longer there in 20 years. And so having the right protections in place to make sure that either an activity kind of leads to a permanent impact, or if it doesn't, the right safeguards are in place to kind of manage any risk of reversals. That's incredibly important for certain activity types. Leakage, going back to avoided deforestation as an example, it may be fine to protect this pocket of forests which exists here, but if all that means is that this pocket, which is outside of the project's boundary, gets deforested instead, then you're not really having an emissions impact. So making sure that leakage is properly managed and that you're thinking about how activity may spill outside of the project zone is an important factor. And then moving outside of kind of the environmental integrity bits onto other elements, stakeholder inclusivity, which I talked about before, is important at the start of a project's design, but also through the lifespan of a project. So we as Gold Standard were one of the first standards to have a full grievance mechanism in place. And what that means is that if there are any complaints against a project, if there are any allegations of malpractice by a project developer, there is a clear route for these to be raised. And ultimately it may be investigated by us, and kind of projects may be forced to make changes or to deregister from the standard. So making sure that projects are designed in an inclusive way, the right route is in place for any concerns to be raised, that's incredibly important. And then alongside that, making sure that proper benefit sharing is in place. A project isn't sustainable, isn't kind of delivering the impact it should, if all of the value is extracted from the project site and maybe goes abroad. And so well-designed projects, and projects that are often appreciated more by buyers, are ones where it can clearly be shown that local communities are benefiting. There is a proper benefit sharing structure in place to make sure that the value which comes from carbon credits goes back to local communities, businesses, environments, etc. And this is something which is increasingly being required by governments. So there are a number of governments across the world who are saying that if you're going to do a project in this country, you need to make sure that at least X% of the value goes back to the local community. And then two final things, kind of on the negative side and the kind of positive side. So firstly, making sure that the right safeguards are in place against kind of any negative harm that can be done by a project. And so another area where criticism can come, and often does come from projects, well, actually, I say often, rarely comes, but when it does, it comes with impact, is if there are examples of human rights abuses, for instance, or other negative impacts which projects can have. So making sure the right framework's in place to protect against that is important. And then on the other side, looking at how projects can deliver positive benefits beyond just the carbon benefits. And I've mentioned this earlier, but in gold standard, for instance, you can't register a project under our standard unless the project is planned in a way that it will deliver a quantified benefit against at least 2 other sustainable development goals beyond climate action. So every gold standard project has to deliver at least 3 sustainable development impacts. Those have to be quantified, measured, and audited, and that's kind of built into the design of gold standard to make sure that you're not just thinking about carbon, but you're thinking about how projects can be sustainable and deliver beyond that. And then just to finish with a couple of other final slides, I think it's important to reflect on, and maybe we can have this as a point of discussion, some of the ways that carbon markets are criticized. And each of the kind of different, I'll just put them all up, each of the different criticisms which I'm kind of going to point to here, all of them have some validity if things are done in a way which isn't right. And so what we try to do as gold standard, and what others try to do, is make sure that these ways in which markets can go wrong, we avoid that. We try to do things in the right way. So one of the criticisms which you kind of often get is these credits don't represent real emission reductions. And so the question for us as a standard is, how do you make sure that you are writing methodologies, designing rules in such a way that every credit which is issued represents that 1 ton of CO2 reduced or removed? Local communities are unfairly treated. This goes back to some of the points which I raised earlier. How do you make sure that stakeholder engagement, inclusivity is built in from the start, that safeguards are thought about properly, sustainable development priorities are set in the right way, and that there are proper benefit sharing arrangements in place? So how do you make sure that this isn't a project which is done to anyone, but a project that is done with everyone? It's all too complicated in the middle. So some of you may be thinking that after my presentation, carbon markets are complicated, carbon finance is complicated, developing a project under a standard is complicated. And it's one of the kind of balances that we always need to strike, is you make things too simple, and maybe you end up hitting the criticism which you get in the top left of this here, or the top right of this for that matter, where you do have instances where communities aren't fairly treated. You do have examples where credits don't represent real emission reductions. And so a lot of the complexity which is built into this is really there to make sure that we have things as robust as possible. But that does mean that there's complexity. So this isn't the easiest finance to achieve in many cases. We often hear about credits being seen as a way for companies to greenwash. And if you go back, there are examples of that for sure. And there's been a lot of work which is being done in the carbon market to look at how you can have the right claims that companies can make against credits. And we in Gold Standard were one of the biggest advocates a few years ago of moving away from the idea of a carbon neutral claim, because of its ability to be greenwashing and to be misused, and to kind of shield companies from taking other action, and to move to different forms of claims that can be made. And then the final criticism, which is often kind of made, is that carbon markets are the Wild West. And I think one thing which I will definitely say is that carbon markets are hugely imperfect in the way that they are structured. So if you're used to a different type of financial market, this looks very strange, the carbon market. And one of the reasons for that is the carbon market is often known as the voluntary carbon market. This is a market which has existed kind of away from regulation in many ways, and so is built up in its own way. And one of the things that will be very interesting over the next few years will be seeing how things change as we start to see more regulation of the market, which we're starting to see at the moment. In countries like the UK, but also in many countries in the global south, which are kind of having where projects are implemented, we're seeing more regulation of carbon market activity. And my hope is that this kind of addresses some of the reasons why the market can be seen as the Wild West, and makes this a more transparent, well-structured market than it maybe has been in the past. And I wanted to kind of end really by talking about some of the benefits of carbon finance. So I kind of been quite negative in some ways, and pointed to some of the criticisms that you often see. But there are real benefits which you can get from carbon finance, and this is the reason why we have 3,500 projects registered with our standard. The first is that carbon finance provides value to something that isn't otherwise valued in our world. So reducing emissions doesn't have a value outside of the carbon market. And the beauty in what carbon finance is really trying to do is to give a financial value to an activity that has reduced emissions and to reward that. And that kind of financial value kind of attribute of this shouldn't be overlooked. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to do through carbon finance. The second route is that this is a source of private finance in a world where sadly public finance for climate action is being reduced. So we've seen USAID funding cut. We saw earlier this week UK development finance budgets cut, which I'm sure will have implications for climate finance budgets. And carbon finance can be from public institutions. So you have governments who are buying carbon credits, but this is also a market where private finance can come in as well. And so in a world where we need desperately more finance for climate action, carbon markets allow for private finance to come in alongside diminishing public finance. And then finally is this element of SDG impact as well. So increasingly across the carbon market, we are seeing that if a project is going to be valued and wanted by a buyer, it can't just deliver carbon benefits, it has to deliver for wider sustainable development goals as well. And that's something which again is hugely important, and making sure that we're structuring projects in a way where these SDG benefits are really built in, they're properly quantified, they're properly thought about, can lead to real benefits for sustainable development goals beyond just climate action as well. And then just to kind of finish with this slide here. So unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to look at some other standards, but I kind of looked at the projects which we as gold standard currently have registered in Somalia. And there were just these 4 from one project developer. And these 4, you kind of see some acronyms here at the start. VPA means that kind of all of these essentially are part of the same program. So as gold standard, we really just have one program right now in Somalia, which is active, which is supporting clean cooking for households across the country. And only one of these has had issuance of credits yet. And this is quite low compared to some other countries in the region. So Kenya, for instance, as a neighbor, we have 200 projects currently in gold standard. So I guess a kind of prompt for discussion from this is what can come next? What more can we do? And what role do you see for carbon finance in Somalia? I went on a bit longer than I hoped to, but I really hope that was helpful. And I'm going to drop my slides now so we can talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hugh, for that sort of interesting deep dive into carbon credits, climate finance as a whole, especially for someone like myself who often hears the terms being floated around but doesn't really know what it entails, what it involves. But before I open up the floor to a Q&A, there will be a QR code on the screen, which will allow you to submit some feedback. So we really do encourage you guys to drop us a few lines so we can continue improving these forums for you all. We also have our social media handles on there. So please do engage with us on the various sort of platforms, as we have a few exciting things coming up in the pipeline across the year. But yeah, that's enough from me. I'll open up the floor to the audience to ask any sort of questions. But when you do ask a question, can I ask that you begin by introducing yourselves? Yeah, Suban, go for it.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear and see. Perfect. I'm Suban from Switzerland, Geneva. I'm based right now. I studied environmental science in my bachelor, and now I'm doing international and development studies in Geneva. And it has been very interesting to see, especially on Somalia, as I never hear anything about Somalia in my studies, especially on the topic of climate finance. So thank you for organizing. It's also my first webinar. But I was wondering, referring to your statement that there's the critique that carbon markets are often the Wild West, that I have heard, that I've like read some articles saying that there is currently like a scramble for Africa going on, by, for example, Blue Carbon, which is like a privately owned company in Saudi Arabia, where the goal is kind of to find huge areas of land in Africa to offset carbon credits. So to just buy land and then afforest or avoid deforestation, which from maybe a climate mitigation point is good, but is also a bit shady because these areas could be used for agriculture, or if we look at Somalia, these areas maybe would be very important as it gets drier or anything. So I was wondering how you see this developing, or if you have any input regarding that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, so I guess two things to say. So, so carbon markets are part of the UNFCCC negotiations. So there's a kind of part of the Paris Agreement called Article 6, which is the bit which relates to carbon markets. And the blue carbon example got a lot of countries worried in these negotiations. And so a lot of the discussion at the kind of international level over the last few years about carbon markets and kind of how they work internationally has kind of been about how do you safeguard against potential land grabs in this way, and how do you make sure that projects are structured in the right way? Because there can be an important role, as we kind of tried to talk about, for carbon finance. Carbon finance is essentially how can you finance sustainable action where otherwise you wouldn't have had that. So one of the questions which negotiators have been looking at is how do we structure the rules in such a way that we kind of allow for good practice to go on, but we avoid this rush which everyone got worried about with blue carbon. So so it's something which we've been looking at a lot there. Another part of this as well, it's a really interesting question for how governments respond to carbon markets as well on this, because we're seeing more. If you go back 4 or 5 years, there weren't many governments at all which had any regulations around carbon markets, and that's hugely changed in the last few years. And so if you look across Africa, there are now at least 10 countries that I'm aware of which have carbon market frameworks in place for carbon finance projects. And under pretty much all of these, projects need to be approved by the government before they can go ahead. And so I guess this is one of the questions which kind of will be for governments is this, do we want this activity in our jurisdiction? Are we comfortable with this, or do we not want this? And I think governments may not always act in the right way, and they may not always make the right decisions on this. And that'll be one of the things that we need to watch in the next year. So I don't have a perfect answer, or kind of, and I'm sort of, it's something which we're really worried about as well, but hopefully that provides a bit of context on this as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to Idil. Go for it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Hugh, for a really pedagogical presentation. I'm quite new to this topic, so it wasn't at all, for my level, it wasn't very beginners. I have my name is Idil Sheikh Mohammed. I'm also based in Geneva. I'm at the World Health Organization. I work with health systems and health policy research. And one of the things I do work with is our program of work on climate resilient health systems. So that's kind of my entry point into this. And so I have a few kind of points and questions. I'm happy to just give them all to you at once, and then you can answer the ones you feel like to. I really like this thing of additionality. I think it makes complete sense to ask the question of, would this project or would this intervention have happened if it wasn't because of the carbon financing that this organization or whatnot would receive? But I'm just wondering, you did mention that you need to know the baseline and need to know what would what will be delivered from a project or an intervention. But I was wondering how do you guys, it might be a big question, but how do you guys go about determining that additionality aspects when you are working with different organizations? And then I was also coming in, you talked about it briefly about carbon buyers in low middle income countries. So are you seeing more sort of voluntary buyers in these contexts, or are they choosing to engage in carbon finance more than maybe what what do we call it, the compliance buyers, because they have to because of different laws and such? And then the third question, which is again just for my personal interest, would be if you have any projects that are related to health systems or health in general when it comes to carbon financing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So on the first question, so for an additionality assessment, so every project which is registering with our standard needs to demonstrate that it's additional, so it needs the carbon finance. And there are the tools and the kind of way this is done has kind of evolved over the last 20 years and has got better over time. But there are three things that are looked at really. So the first one is regulatory additionality. So is this already required by regulation? So you may have some cases where there's a national policy which requires an activity to take place. If that's the case, we can't provide carbon finance to that too, because the company's forced to do it. It doesn't need the money to do it. The second is financial additionality. So the project needs to provide financial kind of modeling to show, look, it wouldn't make financial sense for us to make this intervention if it wasn't for carbon finance. And this is the bit that's quite tricky, because if anyone sort of works in finance, it's easy to kind of change numbers in a way and to sort of show numbers in a way. So, and this is one of the areas where if you go back 15 years, there was criticism of a lot of projects at the start of the carbon market for not being additional. And so the assessment of financial additionality has got a lot more strict and it got a lot better over time, I think, to make sure that projects aren't putting their figures in a way that's rosy for them really to show that they're additional. It's always a challenge, but that's kind of that second area. And then the third one is a barrier assessment, sorry. So there may be activities where maybe the finances could make sense, but there's just some fundamental barriers to this actually happening within the country. So maybe it's the first of its kind technology within the country, and so it's just harder to get done. And carbon finance can help to address that barrier. So these are the three things that are really looked at for projects to be additional. The core concept has stayed the same, but how these are looked at have changed over time. And then on the second question about buyers, so I think traditionally a lot of the buying of carbon credits has come from Europe, North America, Australia. So it's come from kind of more developed countries. But we expect that to change over the coming years. So if you look at kind of Indonesia and India, for example, as two countries, both of them are actively looking at developing domestic demand. So that might be, some of that may be through kind of compliance and required regimes, but it might also be through creating more expectations on companies to take voluntary action. So there'll be more demand which comes from LMDCs in the near future, we expect. The Middle East, we're expecting to see quite a lot of activity. So we as Gold Standard don't have much presence or kind of much engagement so far in the Middle East, but I think there'll be more which comes from there in the near future as well. And then the example I gave earlier of South Africa, so that's a country which has a carbon tax in place, and you can only use domestic credits. So it's really there to make sure that there's a finance mechanism for domestic projects. Can you remind me of your third question? I apologize, I've forgotten it.
I can also just peruse your website. I was just curious if you have any projects related to health or health systems in general.
Yeah, no, we were speaking to another UN body. I can't remember if it was UNHCR. I can't remember who it was, but we were speaking to UN body the other day, which was looking at how whether they could build kind of off-grid renewable energy for their hospital site, for their kind of medical sites across Africa, and they were looking at whether carbon finance could support that. So they were kind of looking at doing the kind of, go back to my steps, the feasibility to check whether it made sense to do that one. We have a lot of project types which are which have health as a important co-benefit. So clean cooking is one example. We have a lot of safe water supply projects in Gold Standard, which are looking to support the kind of villages to have safer water supply than they otherwise would, and looking, so we kind of provide carbon credits, but those are really health projects in a way, because the health benefit is much stronger than the carbon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll pass over to Naima.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the presentation as well. I'm Naima. I'm also part of Somalis for Sustainability, and I work on a project for climate adaptation. And I was wondering how you at Gold Standard are now working to integrate climate action more strategically, so that it's not only focusing on mitigation projects, but also climate adaptation. And if this is, I think you've mentioned that you're also now working more and integrating the other SDGs and sustainable development, but how is that also happening strategically? That would be my first question. And then my second question is related to CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. How do you foresee how that would affect your work and also affect projects worldwide?
Yeah. So on the first question, the adaptation resilience one, is one that we've been thinking a lot about at the moment. So when we started as Gold Standard, sustainable development was kind of built. So it was before the sustainable development goals, but the idea of projects doing more than just kind of climate action was built in from the start. And then the rest of the market's caught up with us. So we're thinking, okay, what can we do? What's the next thing to kind of sort of make sure that carbon market projects is sort of better as best as they can be? And we're looking right now at introducing new requirements that would mean that all projects have to demonstrate how they are, I'm trying to think of the right word, but basically that they are climate resilient as well. So that's part of the assessment which will be done to make sure that projects are building climate resilience into their design as well. And it might be that we start that out as a kind of label, meaning that some projects can choose to do this, and because it will require some extra work to show it, to build this into the design. So maybe it starts out as a label and then it becomes integrated across all projects. But the challenge that we always have is our standard is harder to use than other standards, because we expect projects to do sustainable development, to do more vigorous safeguard assessments. And we always get complaints when we ask project developers to do more, because they're then in a market where they're competing against standards which kind of ask them to do less. So we want to move to having kind of resilience built into all carbon market projects. That will come. We're not quite there yet, but the other sort of point of this is a lot of projects are just doing this anyway because it just makes sense for them to do. So if you're doing something, you're doing an agriculture project which will last for 20 years, you need to be thinking about resilience. So that's already built in. So really what we'd be doing is recognizing that. And then CBAM is a really interesting one. So as CBAM is structured right now, it doesn't allow carbon credits to be used by importers. Whether the EU changes that in the future will be an interesting thing to watch. So at the moment, kind of you can be exempted from paying if you're subject to an equivalent carbon price in your own country, but not by kind of using carbon credits. And we often see discussion about whether the EU will change that slightly, and it will kind of allow for carbon finance, carbon credits to be used to reduce CBAM liabilities. At the moment, that's not there. If it does change, that would hugely increase demand for carbon finance and carbon credits.
Thank you. We have one question in the chat box. I'm conscious of time, but the question reads, what types of climate finance projects have been the most successful in the Horn of Africa?
Yeah, so a lot of our projects in the region have been clean cooking projects. And in a way, this is which is hugely important. So we've had a lot of clean cooking projects, and those are often set up as programs where you'll have kind of a program across a country, and then smaller projects which are implemented in different countries. Safe water supply is another one which I've mentioned earlier. One of the things which you see in the carbon market is there are certain project types that I think are kind of easier to do and are well known in the market, and so you get a lot of clean cooking projects, a lot of water projects, a lot of renewable energy projects, a lot of avoided deforestation projects, and as a standard we have about 100 different activity types that could be done under our standard, but we have about 4 or 5 that are done a lot. And so it's one thing which is kind of interesting is whether some of these other project types will be taken up more. And so there's huge potential for sustainable agriculture projects, for instance, and we'd be really interested in our sustainable agriculture methodologies being used more in the region. There's potential for others, but at the moment there's quite a lot of focus on clean cooking.
Thank you. I had a quick question, Hugh. I think you were at COP29 last year. Could you kind of share a bit of context of the sort of updates on Article 6 that was sort of focused on sort of climate finance?
Yeah, so Article 6 is it's the part of the Paris Agreement which allows countries to cooperate in achieving their NDCs. So every country has its NDC. Article 6 allows for cooperation between them. And that can be done through markets, as we're talking about here, or through non-market approaches. And there were 2 important things which happened on Article 6 at this COP. One is that countries finalized the kind of overall framework for how different governments can cooperate through carbon markets. And in theory, they're not going to come back to negotiate that for 4 years now, which is really good because it provides a settled framework. So there's been quite a lot of uncertainty for the last few years. And then the second thing that was done was there was adoption of some important rules for a new carbon credit mechanism under the UN. So some of you may be familiar with the Clean Development Mechanism, which existed under the Kyoto Protocol, had thousands of projects registered with it across the world. And there'll now be a replacement for the Clean Development Mechanism under the Paris Agreement. And COP really provided the signal for that to get going, which I think is really exciting for carbon credits and carbon markets under the UN.
Awesome, thank you. This is the last call for any sort of questions. So yeah, feel free to unmute yourself or just drop it in the chat box. Take that silence as that we can move on. But yeah, could I just ask that everybody, a last sort of request to fill out the feedback form. But other than that, thank you very much, Hugh, for taking the time out in your evening to join us and share your insights on this topic. But yeah, thank you all as well for attending.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.